Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. Just doing a video on Archie Gray and maybe a little bit about Yves Bissouma at the end. So stick around for that later on. A bit of interesting news on him. But on Archie, I feel like it's been a big week for Archie, playing in his preferred position in midfield. And we're starting to see in these last two games, perhaps Thomas Frank starting to settle on a preferred 11. Give or take a couple of players. But one of the big criticisms I think of him is he's chopped and changed a bit too much, personnel and formation wise, which has maybe made it a bit harder to have sort of consistent characteristics within his team, which obviously is the ideal scenario for Frank, who does like to mix it up at times, is to have those characteristics, no matter who he plays and what formation he plays. But maybe that's part of the reason why performances have fluctuated a bit at times. But in the last couple of games, admittedly home games against Brentford, who are pretty poor away from home, and Slavia Prague, who are obviously no great shakes, he does feel like he's kind of settling on a team in a 4-2-3-1 formation. And what's interesting from Archie's perspective is he's in it and he's performing really well. I thought he played really well in the last couple of games. And personally, I would like to see him stay there on a regular basis and really start to grow in that position. I mean, he hasn't. When he came in, Frank, in the summer, one of my first players I thought of in the Spurs squad was about Archie Gray, because you think of Frank as being a master developer of young talent. He obviously tried to sign Gray at Brentford, and along with Bergval, Xavi Simons, the other young players in the squad, you really got excited about what he might be able to do with an Archie Gray and where he could turn him into a really top player. But so far, until recently, Gray's kind of had to play a waiting game, mainly because Frank in the beginning seemed to prefer particularly Paulinho and Bentancur in his midfield, but also that calf injury that he picked up, I believe, against Monaco, which sort of disrupted his chances. But now Gray has sort of come into it. We saw against PSG and playing a bit more attacking role, but interesting. And he is capable of playing a sort of number 8 position and sort of breaking the lines, and I think he could be really effective in that way. But I've liked what I've seen from his number 6 performances in the last couple of games. Just from a statistical point of view, he had the most completed passes in the team in both games, apart from Mickey van der Ven. I only think Paulinho made more tackles than he did in the couple of games. So he's had a couple of stats that sort of underline his performance. But just thought generally he was really good. I love the way he dropped in to the fullback position when Spence went inverting and marauding up the pitch, particularly against Slavia. I think that's something we saw. The Ukrainian midfielder, I've forgotten his name of, who played for Brentford during Thomas Frank's time at Brentford when Keane Lewis Potter was going up the pitch. It's something that I thought might suit Gray's style when Frank took over, and it was good to see him do it against Slavia Prague. And going into Forest at the weekend, which is obviously at Nottingham Forest, they're a team that is synonymous with the Gray family, only slightly less so than Leeds, because obviously Leeds being Eddie Gray, Archie's great uncle, is a living legend for them. His granddad Frank Gray played for them too, was a great player for them, and his dad Andy played for Leeds as well. But Andy also played for Forest, and more to the point, Frank obviously won the European Cup playing for Nottingham Forest. So it's always probably quite a special match, that particular game for Forest, for any time a Gray plays against Forest. But more specifically for Archie's current situation, I feel like he's earned the right to start that game and start at number 6 again in that particular match. And the fact they came off after 58 minutes against Slavia when the game was won really does probably mean that his chances of starting again in that position are quite likely. And I feel going forward in the next couple of years, if Gray's given a chance to really flourish in that position, with his energy that he brings, that's probably his biggest asset is his running power. But he's got good football IQ, summed up by that ability to drop in at times. He's just a good all-round player. I think if he could really develop, he could become the beating heart of this emerging young Spurs side. With Bergval alongside him, Xavi in front of him, Van der Ven behind him, lots of exciting young players, Destiny Udogie at left back, Jed Spence, as well as one of the fullbacks. There's a lot of reasons to be excited. And I think Gray can really be that driving force in the middle of midfield. It does remind me, thinking about the sort of profile of some of these players, if Frank can get them sort of gelling and improving, that's the big point, improving these players with his, development techniques, which he's, has a proven track record of. Just look at Ollie Watkins, just look at Ivan Toney, David Raya, list is endless at Brentford, that there can be a similarity to what Poch created with some of the fantastic young players he had and moulded and developed over the years in the 2010s. And just sort of having a look at Archie since he's come to Spurs. I mean, he signed from Leeds 2 summers ago for 40 million, 30 million plus 10 million being Joe Rodon going the other way, which is actually the third highest fee for an 18-year-old behind Rodrigo, Endrick and Vinicius Junior. So serious company that he keeps with that particular transfer fee. And when you look at last season, you got to say it was a success. I mean, for an 18-year-old to play 48 times for his club in one season, ended up as a Europa League winner. No doubt it was a success. But I do feel like we came off the back of that season, or some people did, sort of maybe thinking of Archie as a bit of the Phil Neville of the Tottenham team, someone who was always ready and willing to fill in whatever job he was given, bit of a utility man, obviously came to the fore during that central defensive crisis and played centre-back, even though he'd never played that position before. And if it wasn't there, it was often full-back that he would fill in as. But there's no doubt that he wants to be a midfielder. He always has been. He's always been a midfielder growing up, playing for school, playing the Leeds Academy. It was only when Daniel Farke played him at right-back in that season where they'd loaned Spence but then sent him back, that he played a different position, that he didn't play midfield. And so it is something that's new to him. And like I say, playing centre-back under Ange last season, that was very much having to learn from scratch that particular position. But midfield is no doubt the position he wants to be in. And he doesn't want to be a player who's known as the sort of jack of all trades, master of none. He wants to nail down that midfield position. But at the same time, he strikes me as the kind of player who, if you told him he had to play in goal today, he'd probably do it because he's got that kind of attitude. But he definitely wants to be a midfielder. I'm led to believe, the way Ange really rated him as a player and thought he would be a really good midfielder one day, but don't think he thought he was ready at this stage to be that in the Premier League, which I think is summed up by some of the lack of games he generally played in that position. Yes, he did towards the end of the season, but that was when it felt like Ange was very much playing a B team at times in the Premier League, with the Europa League being the entire focus. And from what I'm told, he generally trained a lot of the time under Ange as a defender, even if he wasn't going to play in the games at the weekend. What's quite different, one of the notable differences with Thomas Frank is I'm led to believe he's been training as a midfielder pretty much throughout the season, even though Frank has also used him as a sort of emergency fullback and centre-back at times. And now Frank is obviously giving him the chance to play in his preferred position in the games themselves. He's also, I'm told, really benefiting from his work with Tottenham's individual coach, Cameron Campbell. I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the summer, Spurs hired Cameron Campbell as a first-team individual development coach. Now, not a lot of clubs have this in the Premier League. Someone who specialises on, focuses on individuals rather than being a sort of general coach of the team. It's something that Thomas Frank was a big fan of because he actually was one earlier in his career, back at Lyngby 20 odd years ago, after he'd sort of been working in schools and working in youth teams. He had this, Lyngby are a sort of very small side part of in Copenhagen. That's where he started working with Johan Langer, who was a coach at the time in the club. He wasn't in the recruitment, he was the coach. And Frank's job actually was as an individual coach, and he worked with the likes of Christian Norgard, a 17-year-old or 16-year-old Christian Norgard, who obviously has gone on to be his captain. I think he was his captain at Brentford, and they tried to sign him in the summer. Obviously went to Arsenal, and Yusuf Poulsen, who's gone on to have a fantastic career at RB Leipzig. Talking of Leipzig, that's where Cameron Campbell used to work. He used to work at Leipzig. He also used to work at Rangers. And I'm told that that Gray is really sort of enjoying and benefiting from this individual coaching that he's got with Cameron Campbell, where they work on a lot of analysis. It's not like Ange didn't do any analysis at all, but it sounds like the analysis has gone up a notch. Under the Frank regime, they have individualized player programs, and Gray is really sort of benefiting from that, as I presume a lot of the players are. He's also benefiting from learning from some of these very experienced pros in midfield like Bentancur and Paulinho, even though they're sort of competing for a position, to get in the team against each other. I think he's, players like that and the professionalism they bring and the experience they bring, I think he's definitely benefiting from that. And Archie's just looking in a good position right now. And funny enough, I've watched him a few times this season and thought it looks like he's bulked up a bit. But I'm told his sort of weight level is believed to be pretty similar as last year. So it must be my eyes deceiving me. I don't know if any of you guys have noticed that or seem to think that as well, that he looks a bit physically stronger. But he definitely seems to have got to grips with the Premier League in midfield more now. I think a big part of that is it's so different when you play midfield compared to particularly defence, where everything's pretty much in front of you. Midfield, everything's coming from all angles. And even though he's grown up being a midfielder, he's obviously kind of got out of the habit of it from where he often played last season. And even if he hadn't, it's obviously a step up to start thriving in the Premier League in midfield. But I think he's done well in the last couple of games, starting to work well with the defenders behind him, and obviously Xavi in front of him and Paulinho next to him in the last game. So it's an interesting. It's been an interesting time for Gray, because in the summer, if you remember, talking of Forest, because he's going to come up against Elliot Anderson, who's now looks a shoe-in to start at number 6 for England. They both were at the under-21 Euros. I think a lot of fans, not just at Spurs, but mainly because of the names, would just presumed Archie Gray would be starting for England, but it didn't work out that way. Elliot Anderson, at the time, I think not many fans outside of Newcastle and Forest were that aware of, started in that midfield alongside Alex Scott of Bournemouth, who I interviewed earlier this season, and they absolutely hit it off. Went all the way to, and they won the trophy to retain the trophy that they won 2 years prior when I was covering the under-21 team. That was out in Georgia. This time was out in Slovakia. And Archie didn't really play that much of a role, to be honest, in England's tournament victory, which I'm understandable that he was disappointed by that. But I think the logic from Nikazi's perspective is he did sort of prioritise players this was going to be their last tournament at age group before they got too old. And that's definitely the case with Anderson, who's now 22, so he'd be too old. Same with Alex Scott. Whereas Archie can go again. It's very similar to the time I was covering them. Rico Lewis was left out of the squad entirely because they knew he'd come back in later on in favour of Max Aarons, which, obviously Rico Lewis I think is a better player than Max Aarons. I think most people would agree with that, but that was the logic there. Harvey Elliott, for example, was more of a player off the bench in that 2023 triumph, again for the same reasons, whereas he was in the summer much more of a key player, kind of a forgotten man now with what's happened to him at Aston Villa. But that's kind of how Carsley dealt with it, and you have to say, you can't argue with it because they went on and won the competition. But it's an interesting sort of trajectory when you look at what's happened to Elliot Anderson since, the way he's gone on to become this fantastic find for Thomas Tuchel alongside Declan Rice in midfield. And now you wouldn't want not to play him there because of the balance he brings and the way he's emerged as apparently £100 million footballer. I mean, it seems a bit excessive, but that's what people are talking about, and looks like he might be ready for a really big move at some point. But I think Archie, who's 3 years younger, remember, if things can go well for him and he has a manager like Thomas Frank who really believes in him and gives him the chance to start to flourish and improve, there's no reason why he can't do something similar. And I feel like now is the time to really put his faith in him, and I hope he starts at Forest again. and the coming games going forward, and really starts to show what he can do. Because I think he's got all the attributes on paper to really thrive in that position. And I know he's motivated by looking at the likes of Elliott, obviously playing for England, very likely to start the World Cup. Alex Scott hasn't got a cap yet, but he was in the last squad. So again, two of his sort of contemporaries that he very much can look for motivation. So let's see. What do you think with Archie Gray? Do you think it's right now that he's getting his time in the starting 11, or do you think I'm overhyping him? What do you think? Because it seems like some fans don't quite, almost not sure what he brings to the party. Others very much can see it and love some of his some of the things he does and the selflessness that he has in his game. And I also think, like I said before, that he's got the ability to play further forward if he needs. He can break through his lines. I think he can score goals, but all of this will come with confidence and game time. Just do you really think that Spurs? I could have easily picked Lucas Bergvall. He's maybe their biggest gem that they've got of a young player, but Archie's right there with him. They're very, very close, the two of them, and I think he really could be someone who could be very much the future of Tottenham. And as a neat segue, obviously Yves Bissouma sadly feels like he's not the future. Pretty much expecting him to move on in January if Spurs can move him on. He was very close to leaving Fenerbahce in the summer. But the move fell through after he got injured. He's nowhere near Thomas Frank's plans. Thomas Frank was left him out, obviously, the PSG Super Cup game, citing persistent lateness, which is pretty unprofessional, let's be honest, from Yves' perspective. And then talking about unprofessionalism, I cannot believe it's the second time in just over a year that he's been filmed inhaling nitrous oxide. Whatever you think about that, that's not what footballers should be doing. And no doubt he's under some sort of probe from the club and will be will face the consequences. I mean, he had it last time. He had a 1 game imposed ban. Obviously, that's unlikely to happen now. If it does, no one's going to notice because he's not going to be near the first team at the moment. But no doubt a fine as well is probably what is likely. Though I imagine Spurs will never sort of talk about it publicly. But anyway, the interesting thing about Bissouma is whilst I imagine, I'm pretty sure Spurs will fully look to sell him in January, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be sort of revived interest, particularly from Turkey, that if he doesn't move on, Spurs are likely, or there's a very good chance that they will actually take up the option on his contract rather than let him leave for free in the summer. Which I find quite surprising at first, but it makes sense, I guess, because rather than let him leave for nothing, it's not to look to keep him. It's purely just to make sure retain his value so they can get some money for him. If they don't sell him in January, they'll look to sell him again in the summer. But I'm led to believe it's likely that they would take up the option on his contract just to protect his value and look to get some money there to reinvest into the squad then, which I guess makes a lot of sense. But when I first discovered that, I was slightly surprised because I just presumed he would just walk out on a free transfer if he doesn't move this January. But like I say, pretty much expecting, so long as they can find a buyer and he's fit enough, that Yves Bissouma, obviously he was about to head off to African Cup of Nations as the Mali captain, will probably move on. And I wonder if we'll see him play again for Spurs, which is sad really, because he's someone that I watched a lot even before he came to Spurs, because I used to cover Brighton, always knew his talent, and really felt like he'd earned a big move to a club like Tottenham. But overall, has he been as successful? He won the Europa League and he was a big part of it, coming into the team late on in the semi-finals and the final. I thought he was fantastic, and he really felt like he played his part. So that in a nutshell, probably that in itself is maybe sort of worth the money they paid for him. But overall, sadly, a bit of a disappointment. And when you look back at that summer, actually, that they signed him, I remember looking at the business that happened under Conte that summer, and you thought even Perisic was just what Conte wanted. Fraser Forster was obviously a free backup goalkeeper, but pretty solid. Yves Bissouma, Richarlison, done well at Everton. Clement Longley, I think most people at the time were a bit disappointed they hadn't pushed the boat out, including Conte, to sign a sort of Bastone or a centre back, and they were loaning Longley. But in the main, I guess you're always going to be positive at the time. It felt like a pretty good window, and then there was Jed Spence, who Conte instantly described as a club signing. I suppose the irony is when you look at all of those players that were signed, it's actually ironically Jed Spence who's been the most successful player. It took a long time for it to happen, but he's probably the one who has the most long-term future at the club, albeit Richarlison's having a bit of a revival this season. And, I think Conte has spoken about, missing out on the sort of prime targets that summer. It felt like Spurs, that was a big summer because it was after the season that they beat Arsenal to the 4th Champions League spot. And maybe they bought the wrong players, really, on reflection. And Yves Bissouma, when you look at the totality of his Spurs career, caveated by the fact that he did play a big part in them winning a trophy, which rarely happens at Tottenham in recent years. You have to say he was one of those. Anyway, that was my sort of update on Yves Bissouma and my thoughts on Archie Gray. Love to hear your thoughts on him and whether you think he can be the man for Tottenham going forward in the number 6 role. Cheers, guys.